Hi, I'm Rayla White Spreggins, founder of Assata's House, and welcome to Tending Our Gardens. This offering is part of our holistic postpartum support initiative for Black and Brown families in Philadelphia, funded by the Reinvestment Fund. We created it because new parents deserve nourishment, not only food, but community, guidance, and care that honors the fullness of their being. What you're about to watch is an asynchronous workshop from our educational series. We kept these sessions real and grounded so they feel like you're in the room with us. Wherever you're joining from, I invite you to arrive as you are. Take a breath, get comfortable, and let this moment be of tending to your body, your spirit, and your postpartum journey. Thank you for allowing us to walk alongside you. I'm glad you're here. Let's begin. Dr. Praise Iyowawe is a queer Nigerian American psychologist from Houston, Texas, specializing in reproductive psychology, perinatal mental health, trauma, and Black women's sexual pleasure and wellness. Her clinical practice is open to all adults, though her research and care often focus on Black women and femmes. She was inspired to pursue this work by witnessing how centering pleasure and healing can transform lives, healing people to align with their values, reclaim agency, and rediscover joy. Her connection to this path is reinforced daily by the affirmation that this work is not only for her personally, but also meaningful in the lives that she touches through her care.
I will share my screen to start. All right. Okay. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining and for being present for this workshop where I will be talking about parenting through grief and trauma. My name is Praise Iowai. I am a clinical psychologist and I'm based here in the Philly area. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you what I have to share today, and I hope that it's helpful for you. So my plan for this workshop in terms of what I'm planning to talk about is I want to go through a little bit of a historical context for grief, talk about some of the different kinds of grief that people and parents can be experiencing, talk about how grief shows up in the body and in one's life. And then I want to provide some specific tools and tips and strategies for parenting through moments of grief and through chapters of grief. And then I also would like to provide some additional resources for support. So the first piece is a historical context for grief. I think it's important to situate the grief that one person might be experiencing individually to the grief that might be in the community, might be in the collective, and might be part of things that have happened generationally. So sometimes one's individual grief is connected to the historical context of how oppressed people's lives have either been cut short or dimmed in some way. This includes by different kinds of violence. So I think about the violence of slavery, the violence during the Jim Crow era, different forms of violence related to family separation or imprisonment or inadequate healthcare, poverty. All these different things can create grief in different ways. And here in our current moment in 2026, there's the grief that we are still reckoning with the pandemic from that started in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, but also grief related to the heightened racial reckonings that have happened in 2020 and beyond. And then the continued racial and gendered violence and injustice, threats of deportation, family separation, reduced access to healthcare, increased economic stress. All of these different forms of violence are happening in our communities, and that can impact our loved ones, our families, and ourselves and the world at large. So it's no wonder that grief would show up in this context because these are mass forms of trauma that can situate and inform the individual forms of trauma that folks are also sometimes experiencing, which can then lead to the context of grief. So when I think about grief, I think about this as the definition. Grief is really a state or a time or a chapter of deep sorrow or anguish, often due to loss. And we can be grieving so many things. Often grief is thought about regarding the death of a loved one, and that's, of course, very valid. And there are other forms of grief too. There are other things to grieve. There can be grief around changes in our lives or changes to our bodies. There can be grief at the state of the world. For some parents in particular, there can be grief around the world that their children will be inheriting and how that's very different from the world that they grew up in. Sometimes there's grief around losing a particular role or identity that you once had, maybe as a partner to someone, or as a parent to someone, or as a person with a particular job title. There can also be grief due to illness. Um, there are different kinds of grief that people can encounter, and there are actually four types of grief that people experience that often aren't recognized as loss, excuse me. I include these in here and I want to bring them up so that you know that if you are someone who has experienced this kind of grief or other kinds of grief that are related to this, that your grief is valid too. So the one I want to talk about first is stigmatized loss. Stigmatized loss is a form of loss that involves shame, blame, hopelessness, and distress. And this is a loss that is related to stigmatized identity. So, for example, being queer or being part of the LGBTQ plus community. It can also, stigmatized loss can also be related to illnesses that are stigmatized, such as HIV or such as addiction to substances. There can also be stigmatized loss that's related to particular experiences that people don't talk about openly often, such as having an abortion or experiencing infidelity from a romantic partner. So this stigmatized loss, the stigmatized piece is that there is outward social stigma about the type of loss that has been experienced in some way. And then I want to move to ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is really more about the intangible losses where a person might be physically absent from your life, like you don't see them in person anymore, even though they're physically here on the earthly plane. So this can happen with parents or children of divorce, or as well as loved ones who are incarcerated, or a parent who, for example, might put up a child for adoption, might grieve that as well. These are forms of grief that are ambiguous, in part because the person is still here on the earth, but they aren't in one's day-to-day life in the ways that they might have been previously. And then if we talk about anticipatory grief is about the anticipation of death, the grief that death is coming to somebody that you care about, such as a loved one with a terminal illness, or particular kinds of late-stage cancer, or anticipatory grief with a loved one struggling with addiction. Anticipatory grief is just as real as these other forms of grief that I'm talking about. Even though the death of the person has not happened yet, the reactions and the things related to anticipatory grief can be so strong that it is also recognized as a time of grief, as a type of grief. And then with disenfranchised grief, it's really about grief that's not allowed to be openly acknowledged or that others don't understand or take seriously. It's a type of grief that's not socially recognized. So there are many different kinds of different franchise grief. I think about grieving pets, the death of pets, grieving miscarriages, for some folks grieving the loss of cultural traditions or customs, um, grieving the end of a relationship with a partner or with a metamor within a polyamorous dynamic where other people don't understand what it is to have lost that partner, to have lost that metamor that you were in relationship with. There's disenfranchised grief also when there's estrangement, where someone hasn't died, but they have chosen to end the relationship in either a family or a friend or a loved one context. So, for example, say a child who has decided to have a firm boundary and stop talking to their parents. There's disenfranchised grief there because while that person is still alive, there is a estrangement of that relationship. These are all examples, again, of disenfranchised grief, where that grief isn't really socially recognized and folks don't really know how to deal with it or how to talk about it. And so when that can be the case, people can either sometimes minimize the grief that that person is experiencing, or they might be prevented from grieving because it's really the thought of like, oh, that's not something to grieve, is what other people might think, not understanding what disenfranchised grief is. So when you put one's individual experience of grief over the collective grief that we have experienced, thinking about the systems of violence and trauma that I mentioned earlier, all of this put together can make it very hard to function, or it can make it so that one is over functioning, kind of as a way to push down the grief or to push down the feelings. But we know that those things can happen, but often aren't helpful. And so I want to transition a little bit to talking about the different ways that grief can show up. So I have four different ways here that grief can be present in one's sort of individual life. And so grief can show up for us so many ways individually. One of the ways that can be most recognizable is that grief shows up in the body. It can show up through changes in eating. Some people move to eating too little when they're in grief, and some people move to eating too much. It can show up in changes in sleeping. Again, either sleeping too little, being unable to fall asleep because of the grief, or sleeping too much because of the grief. Some folks, grief shows up in the body through different physical health concerns. And this can really be in part to the fact that there's more inflammation in the body. This can mean more physical health issues. There can be more pain, more digestion issues, more headaches. Some people literally feel pain in their heart from the heartache that they're experiencing. All of these different things can be as a result of grief. Grief can also show up in the mind in different ways. Some people, the grief that they're experiencing shows up in the mind and their thoughts. They might have thoughts like, how can I go on without this person in my life? Or their thoughts continue to go back to that person, and they have no control over it. Grief also impacts the mind sometimes in that there can be a fog. And that grief fog can kind of make it harder to complete tasks. It can make it harder to concentrate, harder to process information, harder to remember things. People sometimes talk about being in this fog of grief where it takes more effort and things feel more exhausting. Everything just feels more difficult to do. I know I have spirit next on here, but I'm actually going to move to emotions as the next one. And we know grief can impact us emotionally too. People often think about sadness when they think about grief, but there's actually a wide range of emotions that can come from grief. There are things like anger, disappointment, shame, betrayal, confusion, surprise. All of these different feelings can be a part of grief. There's also other feelings, like there can be joy in grief, there can be relief in grief, and those can really also complicate feelings of grief because people don't always expect to feel or sometimes feel guilty in feeling positive emotions in the grief that they're experiencing. And then I want to move to spirit and how grief shows up in one's spirit. Now, mind you, this is different for everyone, of course, but grief can also show up in one's spirit, in one's kind of essence of their life. At times, people can really feel fundamentally changed by the grief that they've experienced, like they were one person before they lost a beloved and are going through grief, and now with the grief, they're a different person. Some people, grief affects their spirit in how they relate to their higher power. Some folks can get mad at God if that's their higher power, or their ancestors, or whatever spirits they're in community with. They can get mad at those spirits or spiritual sources for allowing this to happen, for allowing that person to die, for allowing that trauma to occur. And that can be a part of grief too. That feeling more distant from one's higher power or from one's spiritual sources of support can be a part of grief as well. So I think one of my big takeaways from kind of going through these different types of grief as well as talking through how grief shows up, is to really emphasize the fact that grief impacts everybody differently, and there is no one right way to grieve. Grief happens on different timelines for everyone. Um, people because there is no one way to grieve, people often ask the question, well, am I normal for feeling this way for so long? Or am I normal for how this is impacting me? Or am I normal for X, Y, and Z? I want you to know that there is no one way. There's no correct way to do grief. Everyone, when they're moving through grief, they're moving through it at their own pace and in their own way of doing so. Something that often comes to mind for me is the how there can be change with grief too. And you might have seen this image before, but I think it's important to include here and reiterate is that grief, even though people think that grief shrinks over time, they think, okay, as more time passes, grief feels smaller and smaller. That's actually not the case for a lot of people. What really happens is that we grow around our grief. As time passes, our life sort of is able to situate and accommodate that grief differently over time rather than the grief actually getting smaller. So your container for grief is what has changed, is what has gotten bigger, as you see here. So it's not that the container of your life stays the same, it's that the container gets bigger and that there's more room, there's more space to hold the grief of the loss of that loved one or the loss of that role or the loss of whatever someone is grieving. And oftentimes as we're grieving, we're trying to navigate two things. We're trying to give ourselves the space to grieve as well as coping with day-to-day life. And if you are a parent, part of that coping with daily life is parenting, particularly if you're parenting young children. And being a parent, so trying to care for yourself as well as grieving, as well as caring for another person and raising a human life, or human lives, if you have multiple children that you're caring for, can be one of the hardest things to do. So I want to go through some tips to help, some ways that can be helpful for parenting your children, but also caring for yourself through the grief at the same time. My first tool or strategy here or reminder is to make sure you care for yourself. And this can be very difficult to do at times when you're parenting young kids. And it feels like your main priority or one of your main priorities is to sustain the life of the child that you are raising or the children that you're raising. But I'll offer to you something that's often said on planes during when the flight attendants are sort of going through the pieces of airplane safety, which is if the oxygen masks fall down, to put your own on first as a parent before putting your child's on their face. And we know that this is because when you, the parent, are nourished well, when you have your flow of oxygen going through, you are in more of a capacity, you have more of a headspace to care for your kid or to care for your children. And so I think the same thing is true in grief. Um, Even though grief often pulls us away, oftentimes from the things that we use to care for ourselves, I will implore you and I'll ask you to prioritize self-care as much as possible through the ways of eating foods that feel nourishing to you, through hydrating your body, so drinking water, drinking nourishing teas, and resting as much as possible. And know that rest is not just sleep. Rest can be active rest as well. It can be walking. It can be moving your body in different ways. It can be a lot of different things. Rest is not just laying in bed, of course, even though that is a part of it as well. So I named this one, even though it is difficult to do, caring for yourself while caring for young children can be hard to do. I think it is something that is important to mention and to try to prioritize as much as possible. And what can help with that self-care is doing so in community, doing so with support. And so finding a network for support, even if that network is one other person, can be helpful. And there are different kinds of support that can be useful to have throughout times of grief. Sometimes you might need emotional support where you as a parent are talking maybe with another parent that you trust in about the grief that you're experiencing and how hard it is to go through this experience of grief plus caring for your child or caring for your children. Sometimes it's physical support. Sometimes you're not in a space where you want to talk with somebody about the grief you're experiencing, but it's like, okay, I really need to um, get this shelf built as an example. Is there someone who you can call who can come over and y'all can do that task together? Sometimes just having another adult present, who is there and can help you with the things around the home that you're doing, can be a form of support that can be helpful throughout the grief because it lightens the load. You don't have to do it all on your own. And then there's also care support. So is it possible to find care support, someone to watch your children, someone to help with the meals, someone to help with the laundry, care support in these ways. So as you are in the midst of grief and caring for your children, again, you're not holding it alone. There is someone or some people who can take shifts or can offer support in these ways in a time limited manner. So finding outlets and ways of these forms of support can be really helpful for moving through the grief that you're feeling. Um, and with the emotional piece, I want to mention that sometimes people don't feel as comfortable sharing about their grief with someone who is already in their life. There's can become some concern around trust, which is which happens, we understand. And so for some people, they feel more comfortable turning to online forums or spaces where they feel seen by other people who are experiencing grief in the same way or who have experienced grief in similar ways. And so towards the end, I'll have some resources where there are some websites um, with some different forms of grief that folks have experienced that it might be helpful to go to turn to for that kind of support. All right, so then moving forward, another component that can be especially difficult when it comes to parenting through grief is how to talk about death with your child. And so everyone is going to have their own ways of talking about death or dying or the person who has passed on, like with their children. Um, but these are some tips I want to offer for that part. So the first one is to be honest with your child or with your children about death. You want to use language that's gentle, but also direct. Because if you're folks, sometimes when people use words like, oh, this person has passed on, or oh, this person has gone to heaven, that can actually create confusion. I have the word future here, but it actually should say further. It can actually confuse the children further as to what is going on. For an example, if you say, okay, well, so and so has passed on, the child will be like, okay, well, passed on where? Did they go somewhere? Are they at somebody's house? Can we go visit them? There can be other questions that come up when we're not using the particular words of what has happened, of what it is that a person has died, even though it's, of course, understandably extremely difficult to do so. You also want to be honest with children, and with your child by naming the emotions that are coming up for you and remind them that your emotions that you're experiencing are not their fault. So for example, say someone is a parent and they're in a moment of sadness, they're crying over and they're remembering the person who has died and they're crying and their child sees them and it's like asking why they're crying. The parent can say something to the effect of, oh, I'm crying because I'm sad right now. I really miss the person who died. Crying is part of how I express my grief because I know I'm not going to see them again here. And so there are different ways to kind of be honest about your own feelings that are coming up and telling the child, if you're a parent, if you're a mom, mommy, you're sad right now. It's not your fault. It has nothing to do with what you did. This is part of what it is for me to grieve. And letting them know that it's also okay to name and express the emotions that are coming up for them. And even as you're telling them this, Be aware that children still might not completely understand. There are different developmental stages that kids go through, and it can take some time for them to understand concepts like death that can really feel abstract. Um, and so it will take some time for them to understand it. And because of that time, they also might express their emotions differently when it comes to death, and when it comes to a person who has died. And so I'll encourage you to continue to check in with your child over time to see how they're doing. Know that it's also okay to ask your child, like if they can ex kind of say back to you what you said to them. So as you're explaining what it is for someone who like for a loved one to have died, you can say like, "Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, can you say that back to me in terms of what you understood?" And then that can give you some space of like, "Oh, okay, they understood this piece, but not this piece." Um, like what would be helpful for that? It can also be helpful to find different books that are geared towards kids of your child's age that y'all can read together, where they can understand death through what a child has experienced in the story. And then you can kind of talk with them afterwards about, okay, well, you see how so and so died in this book, and the main character of the child tried to understand it. That's also something that we're experiencing here. Those kinds of things can really help it click for a child too. So, as you're parenting through grief, I think one of the important things to do is to honor the person that you have lost, particularly if it's the loss of a loved one. Um, Finding ways to honor them can include many different things, like having pictures of the person up in your home. Sometimes it can mean sharing stories about the person who passed. Sometimes it can means going to visit their gravesite. For others, it might look like preparing and sharing their favorite foods. And know that if it's appropriate, you can also involve your children in this honoring too, by telling them stories of the person who has died, or by doing things with your child in their memory, saying, "Oh, grandma really loved gardening. Come be in the garden with me," for example. Let me show you these flowers that grandma really liked. Do you want to help me plant them? Like things of that nature as an example. Um, Teaching and passing on skills of the person who has passed that you think your child might like. And that can be a really beautiful way to not only honor the loved one who has passed away, but also to form these connections between your child and yourself and the loved one who has passed. The last tip that I'll offer today is to express your grief. Grief, like I said, can involve so many different emotions, and grief can feel really tangled up and really confusing in so many ways. For some people, it's an overwhelming sadness, but for other people, there can be lots of different emotions that are involved. Like I mentioned, anger, despair, hopelessness, um, shame, guilt, sadness, sometimes relief, all these different feelings. And art can really transmute grief. It can feel like an honoring of the person who has passed, as well as an honoring of yourself and of your own process. I think it can be a really beautiful way for caring for yourself. So perhaps this expression of grief happens through music, through listening to songs, through singing songs, through writing poetry, through dancing, or through being in nature and communing with nature as a way of communing with the earth and all of the spirits in it, including the spirits of the folks who you love who have passed on. And know that again, you can involve your children in these activities if it's appropriate. Perhaps singing songs together, writing together, dancing together, being in nature together. All these different things are ways where there can be space where you can care for yourself as well as care for your child. So, like I mentioned, grief can happen in many different ways, and we can be grieving so many different things. And I think for sometimes grief gets to the point of intensity that it also includes thoughts of death or suicide. What I encourage people to do is to find your reason for going on, even in the midst of grief. What is your reason for continuing to be here? Um, Maybe it's your child, maybe it's your children, maybe it's honoring your loved one's legacy. Um, it can be many different kinds of things. Maybe it's hope that tomorrow might be better than today. But I encourage you to find your reason for making it through the day, even if the grief is present in a way that feels overwhelming. And with this, know that if you are experiencing thoughts of suicide, that there is help. Um, there is help through some national support lines. I'm dialing 88988, excuse me, 988. Dialing that number can connect you to someone who is trained to help in times of support, in times of crisis, and when thoughts of suicide get very intense. Or if you go to the website www.988lifeline.org, you can also find resources there for support. And then lastly, I want to end with some specific grief resources. I have the number 988 here as the website. And then also a specific resource for grief is this website, speakinggrief.org. And they have particular resources for parenting through grief. And they also have stories and video clips of folks and their experiences of parenting through grief, ways to support people who are grieving, and different kinds of things that can be helpful for people who are experiencing grief in different ways. I also included this podcast episode called Grieving the Loss of a Loved One from Dr. Tama Bryant, who is a licensed psychologist, who is very well versed in talking about grief as it relates to moving through and dealing with and holding and navigating grief. And then I also have some places here in terms of resources to connect to for someone who is seeking therapy. The Loveland Foundation is a resource that is specifically meant for Black women and femmes and for connecting someone to a therapist with a number of free sessions. Therapy for Black Girls is a directory of Black women psychologists across the US. Black Men Heal involves resources for support and a directory for Black men looking for therapy. And therapyforqpoc.com is a resource for therapy for people, connections to therapy for folks who are queer, LGBTQ identified in some way, and or people of color. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention. I hope there were some pieces within this presentation that were helpful for you. I hope you remember to hold yourself gently and kindly as you move through whatever kinds of grief that you are experiencing. And I'm sending you peace and I'm sending you calm. Take care.